Which of these 5 places do you think will open first? The Kaesong Industrial Complex shut down 10 years ago. Tours to Mount Kumgang ended back in 2008. Most people think inter-Korean exchange is completely dead. But there's one thing almost nobody talks about. Over the last decade, North Korea has quietly built a new generation of exchange hubs. There's just one problem. They weren't built for Seoul. Analyzing the Korean Peninsula from the ground in Korea. No cliches, just facts. Today, we look at the 5 places North Korea has been preparing after Kaesong and Kumgang, and the real strategy behind them. First, we need to understand something important. Kaesong and Kumgang are not just post projects. The political system that made them possible no longer exists. The Kaesong Industrial Complex operated from 2004 to 2016. At its peak, more than 120 South Korean companies operated there, employing around 54,000 North Korean workers. It was the most successful economic cooperation project in Korean history. But the entire system depended on one assumption, that North and South Korea were still moving toward reunification. That assumption is collapsing. Kim Jong-un has increasingly defined the relationship as one between 2 hostile states, not 2 sides of one nation. North Korea's official messaging has also shifted toward treating the South as a separate enemy state. In that environment, rebuilding a South Korean industrial zone inside North Korea becomes far more difficult. Kaesong is not dormant anymore. Kaesong is over. Mount Kumgang is even more complicated. Tours stopped in 2008 after a South Korean tourist was shot and killed. The facilities were left unused for years. Later, North Korea openly ordered some South Korean-built facilities to be removed. After the 2018 summit, there was hope tourism might restart, but nothing happened. The infrastructure faded. The trust faded too. So, here's the real question. What was North Korea doing while Kaesong and Kumgang disappeared? The answer is a lot. Pyongyang was building a completely different system, just not one designed for South Korea. The first place is Rason. Rason sits in the far northeast corner of North Korea, near both China and Russia. It became North Korea's first special economic zone in 1991. For years, it looked like a failure. Poor roads, weak electricity, very little foreign investment. Then, things started changing in the 2010s. China upgraded roads and power lines. Russia modernized rail connections. Russia also secured long-term access to part of Rason's port. And the port matters. Rason is one of the few ice-free ports in the region. It connects northeastern China and Russia's Far East directly to the Pacific Ocean. Unlike Kaesong, it is nowhere near Seoul, but it already has ports, railways, and power infrastructure in place. That's the key point. If inter-Korean relations ever improve again, South Korean companies would not need to build from scratch. They only need access to an existing network. Ironically, Rason was never built for South Korea, but one day it could become one of the most useful hubs for future cooperation. The second place is Wonsan-Kalma, and this may be the most underestimated project in North Korea today. Back in 2018, during the Singapore summit, Donald Trump told Kim Jong-un that North Korea had beautiful beaches that could become major tourist destinations. At the time, many people laughed at the comment, but North Korea actually moved forward with the project. In 2025, the Wonsan-Kalma coastal tourist zone officially opened. Large hotels, resorts, Water parks, theaters, and entertainment facilities were built along the coastline. The area can reportedly host around 20,000 visitors. At first, it mainly targeted domestic tourists and some Russian visitors. A small number of Western tourists were briefly allowed in. But the program quickly stopped. So why does Wonsan matter? Because it functionally replaces Mount Kumgang. Kumgang was built mainly for South Korean tourists. Wonsan was built as an international tourist platform from the beginning. And because it sits on North Korea's east coast, it could eventually connect to South Korean ports in Gangwon province. This is not a geographic replacement for Kumgang. It's a functional replacement. North Korea already built the next tourism platform. The third place is Sinuiju, along with nearby Hwanggumpyong. Sinuiju is North Korea's largest border city with China. It faces the Chinese city of Dandong across the Yellow River. It is the main gateway for trade between North Korea and China. For years, Pyongyang tried to turn Sinuiju into a major economic zone. Most of those projects failed, but recently, new signs of activity have appeared. Satellite imagery showed North Korea upgrading infrastructure connected to the new bridge China built across the Yellow River. Hwanggumpyong was also planned as a joint development zone with China. Progress remained limited, but the idea itself still matters. Because Sinuiju was never designed for South Korea, it was designed for a Chinese capital. And that may be exactly why it becomes important in the future. Sinuiju is one of the few places where Chinese investment, South Korean technology, and North Korean labor could all meet together. But that also makes it politically sensitive. China increasingly views this region as part of its own economic sphere. The first place is Mount Paektu. This is not an economic zone. It's something much more powerful, a symbol. For both Koreas, Mount Paektu sits at the center of national identity. North Korea presents it as a revolutionary holy site. South Korea sees it as the spiritual mountain of the Korean people. In 2018, Moon Jae-in and Kim Jong-un stood together on Mount Paektu. It became one of the defining images of that diplomatic moment. North Korea developed parts of the surrounding tourism infrastructure, including Samjiyon Airport and nearby roads. Large-scale economic projects are unlikely here, but politically, Paektu matters enormously. If relations improve again, a joint tourism project to Mount Paektu would carry deep symbolic meaning. Kumgang was a tourist destination. Paektu is something closer to a national sharing. And finally, there are Haeju and Nampo. English language media rarely discusses them, but strategically, they may be some of the most important locations on this list. Haeju is a port city on North Korea's west coast. It sits only about 100 kilometers from Incheon. In the past, the area was even discussed as a possible joint fishing zone between North and South Korea. Nampo, meanwhile, is one of the North Korea's largest ports and is directly connected to Pyongyang. It already has industrial facilities and logistics infrastructure. But the real importance is geography. Most of North Korea's economic development over the last decades focused on the Chinese border, or East Coast. The West Coast facing South Korea remained relatively underdeveloped. But if inter-Korean exchange ever restarts, the West Coast becomes the most efficient route. It is the shortest connection to Incheon to Pyeongtaek. Politically, the two Koreas drift apart, but geographically, they never moved. And now the pattern becomes clear. Rason points toward China and Russia. Sinuiju points toward China. Wonsan first opened to Russian tourists. Even Mount Paektu is tied closely to Chinese tourism routes. Meanwhile, the region closest to South Korea remain the least developed. That is the direction North Korea has chosen over the last 10 years. Pyongyang has been building infrastructure for a future without Seoul. But here's the interesting part. Infrastructure survives longer than politics. Once ports, railways, hotels, and logistics network are built, they shape future possibilities whether governments want them to or not. Politics changes, infrastructure stays. Kaesong itself was not created overnight either. North Korea had already experimented with special economic zones for years before Kaesong emerged. History does not repeat itself, but infrastructure accumulates. And that brings us to the conclusion. Kaesong is over. Mount Kumgang belongs to the past. But North Korea spent the last decades building the framework for a new exchange system. And the system points far more toward Beijing and Moscow than Seoul. Future inter-Korean exchange may no longer happen on infrastructure built by the two Koreas alone. It may happen inside networks where China and Russia are already deeply involved. So the real question is no longer whether this hub exists. The real question is whether Seoul can secure influence inside spaces that other powers already entered first. Which of these 5 places do you think will open first? Let me know in the comments.